And we're live. And guys, we have Ben Nelson today here with us. Ben Nelson, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Dude, I'm excited to dig into this today. We were just talking a little bit prior to the show about what you were doing prior to getting into multifamily, and why does what you were doing transitions very well into multifamily. Why don't you give us a background on yourself?
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in Colorado and traveled after college a little bit. I was a ski bum trying to figure out what was going on with my life and kind of fell into production aspects. So building and producing large events around the country and really around the world. I got put into a space where I was able to make some good friends and started producing some action sports events in New York City. And we started there and we got into a niche where we were known to produce some harder things or some more interesting and difficult things. So we found ourselves producing anything from jumping people out of planes and jumping cars and racing planes, all the way down to just bicycle races and things like that. And so through that really developed a niche for ourselves as far as being able to solve problems on the fly, being able to be really creative about problem solving, especially when you're in situations where you're limited resources. You may be in the backcountry or you may be on top of a mountain somewhere, or in the middle of a snowstorm. You got to figure some things out and keep people safe. And transitioning also that when we're producing one on one side of the country, maybe planning something on the other side of the country. And very often that happens. So really sharpen some skills as far as being able to work with folks from afar, being able to questions and kind of be into what we want and build some really strong planning and purposeful plans around how we produce from a distance and how we ask questions and how we vet our providers and how we vet our partners even to make sure that we're going to be successful.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. This is the first time, and I told you before we started the show that this is the first time I heard the term action sports. I
Yeah.
obviously know what it is. I just never heard the term being used, right? And
Yeah, it's sort of the grown-up term for extreme sports. I think the extreme sports gets used more ubiquitously for sure.
dude, that's awesome. Tell me. I know this podcast is not to dig into that too much, but I'm curious to know about a situation where tell me something crazy that happened, or maybe one of the toughest ones that you had to solve through the years that
Oh
maybe
man,
you were pretty excited about how you figured it out.
that's tough. I mean, honestly, and we'll get into this a little bit, but that question you just asked is always solved with good people. People who are smart and calm and capable, out to solve problems will always solve problems. It's about who you put in the room with you every single time, in my opinion. So we've been in places where, we produced a race car event in Brooklyn, New York last summer. It was my last big one before I fully transitioned into this space. We had a hurricane come through about 4 days before we were supposed to produce an entire event, and lightning hit and destroyed everything and tore all of our signs down. And we still put our heads together and we made a way to figure it out. We've had times where we missed communication on top of mountains, and it's no joke. We've had ice storms. We're trying to race desert trucks on top of a mountain in Maine, and all of a sudden we get an ice storm and we can't produce for a day and a half and we get pushed back. So a lot of it is just about being calm in the moment, figuring out what resources are available to you. Sometimes it's a blessing in disguise. I keep all of my notebooks from every event that I've ever produced, and I like looking through them because it's always really interesting what you thought the plan was when you started and where you. A lot of times, little quote unquote happenings or something goes wrong, it creates a situation whereby a problem can get solved for the better, and it creates a path forward that you would not have expected, and it becomes better in the end.
I love it, man. I think this is a pretty good transition into what you're doing now. Can you break down what is it that you're focused on doing now?
Yeah. So I'm one of 4 partners in Wild Oak Capital. We are focused mostly in Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas in multifamily syndication space. So again, there's 4 of us, 2 engineers, a salesperson, myself. I'm primarily focused on the asset management space. So we kind of just touched on that a little bit, but I got into this and really enjoy this space because I like the puzzle. Right? Production for me was always the puzzle. It's always figuring out the problems. So I was getting ahead of it. And asset management is, to me, a lot the same. Getting ahead of the problems, seeing what could be coming next. What can we do to anticipate some problems? How can we facilitate and help our partners? So in this case, it'd be property management. So what do we see can go wrong? ask them. They have some expertise in the space, but we also have the ability to look down the road. So that's what I love about it, and that's what we're working on now. So syndicating deals, we're looking at new stuff all the time. We really love it, and we're excited about the future.
I love it, man. So I like what you just said, because obviously a business plan is kind of like what you were doing in the action sports, right? You have a plan, but things don't go according to the plan, so you have to come up with a plan
Oh
B,
yeah.
figure out different solutions, right?
Something is always going to happen. And I think that's something we talk about all the time is, whether it's in real estate, whether it's in any type of business, anything else, it always surprises me the volume of people that have this, well, I hope nothing goes wrong mentality, right? Something's going to go wrong no matter what. And it's just a matter of how you look at that opportunity. And it kind of comes back to just what we were talking about. If you have a plan, you have the people around you capable and are enabled even to say, what do you think? Can you help us figure this out? What's your solution? Putting people in the room that think differently than you or have a different skill set than you will always help you figure out a problem, and will always help you get to the end. I think back, there's one very particular moment, and I'll shout out to my friend Erica, who actually also has transitioned into real estate. We were producing an event one time, and we're up against it. We had more problems than we thought we were going to be able to solve. And I turned around, and she actually had to leave that day. She was getting on a plane, and she hung a sign up in the office, and it says, "You are going to figure it out just like you always do." And it set calm into everybody else. And we did, we pulled it off. Tomorrow is going to come no matter what you can do, and no matter how hard you try and worry about it, tomorrow is definitely going to come. So the ability to take a breath and figure out, all right, what are my nearest next steps? Not how are we going to get all the way down the line, but what are my nearest next steps to set me up for success? How can we start getting there? What assets do we have at our disposal? And move from there. So that's a long-winded way of answering your question, but
No, I love it, man. And I think that's what makes a good asset manager, because can you break down exactly what your day-to-day looks like as being an asset manager?
Yeah. So we try to follow a lot. One of my favorite books is Best in Class, and it speaks directly to asset management. And the plan in there, it lays out a plan, and I agree with a large volume of what goes into that book. But really, it's about asking questions. Again, it's like how's it going? But tracking and following and having KPIs. We utilize a few different systems. We utilize Slack for communication internally. Use Asana as just a tracking tool to see where things are and kind of project manage. But we also have a spreadsheet that ties into that. So it's a standard KPI tracker for what are our goals overall for the property, what are our goals overall per unit, where are we looking as far as collection concern, delinquencies, what projects are going on property, what projects are going to come on property, when are we turning these units, when do we anticipate? So there's a lot of those things that we track on a day-to-day basis, and we have meetings with our properties weekly. So just about every day we held a meeting with one of the properties, and we get with property management, and we run through those tools, specifically starting with our KPI tracker. Where do we stand this week? How many are vacant? How many are returning? Down the line for all of our KPIs. And it tells a really quick story, and also builds a battle plan for us next, right? So this would be what we would in events call a production schedule. And it helps us build that. So for the next week and the next month, this is our plan. And the point of building that plan is that you don't necessarily have to think about it. And that's where like the systems and every time you hear a lot of like people say systems, right? Like you need to get your systems right. And that means different things to a lot of people. But at the end of the day, what it means is how are you functioning to where you don't actually have to think about it every single minute. If you are asking yourself, what should I be doing right now? You need a system for that, right? When we produce an event, we have 500 different vendors on site. We have people doing different things at all times. And the only way to make that work and the only way to keep it safe is if we've thought about it in depth beforehand, and it's the same, and it's not just my industry. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and there was a woman who was talking about cooking, and her son opened a restaurant, and she was trying to help him and talk him through. And she says, always trust your prep list, because when you get into it and when it's rolling, you're going to start thinking about it. You're going to start second guessing it. When you're in the fire, it's really, really hard to see clearly. But if you've thought about it beforehand, you build a plan, all you have to do is refer to your list.
Yep, exactly, man. I used to fly for the airlines, and we had the same thing. We will always brief like the worst case scenario. If we're on takeoff, if we lose an engine, what's our plan of action? We had that memorized down to the T, because exactly what you're saying. if you don't talk about it, if you don't have the plan, if you lose the engine, dude, there's no way you're gonna figure it out. By then,
Yeah,
it's not gonna happen, right? You need to already have the plan laid out in your mind, so it's almost an instantaneous thought to do whatever you were gonna do if, in the event that the worst case scenario happened. I
100%.
love that, man. Tell me a little bit more about the asset management stuff. What are some of the things that some of the reoccurrent, I don't want to say reoccurring because I don't want to make it sound like you're not taking the proper action to solve it, but like some of the things that you see that happen in asset management that sort of don't go according to the plan, that you end up
Sure.
having to figure out a problem to fix. There are some things that just have happened in the past that you didn't
Yeah,
foresee.
yeah. I by no means there are a lot of people who are far more experienced at this than I am. I just get to pull from what I've learned in other industries and what I've learned in this space, right? Like it's just being smart about how you utilize the tools at your disposal. People are people and I know that's pretty broad, but you can, in my experience, kind of expect the same things. Like people get bored of the same thing, keeping people engaged, keeping people asking questions to find out what's going on, right? Making sure that you are having a tactile response from them when you're asking. So having this meeting every single week. If we see units starting to fall down, we see units starting to fall behind. We see, all of a sudden we were expecting a 1 week for part of this turn to happen. Now it's turned into 2, and it's kind of recurring. What are we doing? And for me, that's we need to get on a plane. We need to go find out what's going on, talk to these people individually, lift them up, and asking what can we do to help you. Right. So that's the thing. So the recurring process, everybody has a different system. Every property manager has a different system for the most part. I mean, like, there's a lot of the same, but the people inside the building are all unique. So how are you reaching out and talking to them in such a way that's responsible? So for me, the thing that happens the most, and it kind of ties in, I mentioned this on a couple other podcasts too. I had a mentor a long time ago and brought me into the action sports world. And there were kind of two key premises. Is like always keep promises you make to yourself and never be afraid to ask questions. So I know I'm kind of roundabout answering your question here, but the thing is, like, if you're asking somebody else instead of telling them you should be doing it this way, that may not work for them. What you want and being really clear about what you want is like, hey, I need these. And that's why I use a spreadsheet. Like we need these things on this time and then with this budget. There can be two different ways to get there depending on how you're working with your vendors. Do you need help finding vendors? Are your vendors overwhelmed? Are you having a problem with X? Are you having a problem with your staff? Finding out what their pinch point is and why it's not happening. And it could lead to you getting a different property manager. Don't get me wrong. Sometimes those answers are not what you want to hear, and you got to make some choices. But being really open to listening to what we've got going on and saying, hey, how can I help you do what you need to do? Is there anything? Is there any tool as a leader of this ship that you don't have that would help accomplish this mission a little bit better? So I think as far as recurring items, there's always going to be a problem. Things, like I said, things are always going to go wrong, man. As soon as you catch a stride, like somebody's going to run into the wall. Like somebody's going to knock something over, or somebody's going to spray paint the side of whatever. Like there's always going to be something to deal with, and anticipating whatever that might be will help you. But more, it's how are you becoming a better leader, because that's ultimately what you are. You're leading these people along. That's your business plan. It's not theirs. You need their help. But how are you getting better at that?
Cool. Love that. So you guys are focused on what kind of assets?
We're primarily in the B class space. We really like that space and a lot of that value add. We're swimming in a big ocean of a lot of people looking at the same stuff, but we're really focused on relationships. And I know that it gets said a lot, but we really like the places that we're in for a lot of reasons. We like the Tulsa, we like the Little Rock, we like San Antonio. They have a lot of metrics that we really like as far as not just up and coming neighborhoods and up and coming demographics, but also where we can go in, do some good for the property, do some good for the neighborhood, elevate everything, and then we're doing good by our investors and by the neighborhood that we're operating in.
What are some of those metrics that you guys like?
So jobs are a big one for us. And I know that that's nothing new, but diversification of jobs. So Tulsa is a great example of that, right? So Tulsa was an oil town. It kind of went bust in 50s and 60s, but it's a beautiful, beautiful town, and their government is really forward looking and really anticipating what it's going to take to succeed in the future. So they've got some incentives to bring back digital nomads. Same thing for Little Rock, especially North Little Rock. There's tons of, it's a beautiful place, man. It's on the river there, and there's a lot going into it that's really, really interesting about it. But diversification of jobs is really the biggest driver for us. San Antonio is a great example as well, where our property sits. It's next to Toyota plants, it's next to an Air Force base. Like, there's a lot of drivers that really help us feel comfortable working with our investors to be able to bring them into the space and say, hey, we've got a plan, and then we've got a plan B, and we got a plan C. We think that this is going to be comfortable in the ups and in the downs. Getting into, when you start having conversations about, like, this is a recession resistant asset, it helps with inflation, all these things, and the why behind that is always people.
Love that. How many units are the apartments that you guys are typically buying?
So it's increasing all the time. So we started off with, like 35s and 45s, getting into 60s. We look at some bigger ones there. So we have been in that just sub 100 for a good little while. And we like that in the sense it is harder to manage, for sure. You're at a place where it's hard to have somebody on site, but really working with property management. And that's why it's such a hands-on job for us, is that working with property management who potentially may have a part-time on-site manager or a manager across a couple of different properties. But we really like the space because we can impact the community really quickly, and we can see some realization of that. And it's also, something we think we're pretty good at. We have been looking at some others. I can't give a lot of that away, obviously, but we anticipate that we'll grow that portfolio into a couple larger complexes. But I don't know that we're ever going to completely get away from what we're doing right now.
Yeah, I love it. And it's kind of like one of those things that if you guys already have the systems down and you're pretty profitable there, even if you move to other type of units or asset class, why shut the faucet off on something that is already almost second nature to you guys, right?
They're cut from the same cloth. They're a little bit different beasts, and every apartment complex is different, and every location is different. So you face different challenges. I think the big thing there is just the adjustment in management and the communication style for that.
Yeah, I love it, dude. What's the Are you seeing any deal flow reduction right now, or are many deals not penciling? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah. I think it's an interesting world out there right now, man. The lending market is absolutely adjusting, as we all know. Deal flow, not necessarily, but deal flow that pencils is changing just because of lending. But I think that there's some really creative people out there, and it's just like when a hurricane runs through the middle of your event, like, people together and makes you look at it differently. People are looking at how we measure these differently. All of a sudden, for a couple of years, bridge debt was that shiny object and everybody's going to it. And now some people are standing with some bridge debt wondering what they're going to do. Fannie Freddie are pretty tight. We found some really strong partners in local banks for a couple of different reasons. And there's also, having some really strong conversation about owner financing, or is there assumable debt on any of this? Like, there's just more of those that existed before, but the creativity on both sides is now becoming a bigger part of the conversation, because if somebody's sitting on something that they either want to or B need to get rid of, they have to come to the table with a little bit more creativity than they did before, right? They're no longer just the belle of the ball. Everybody wants to make a deal, but it's far more expensive to do it in the way that we were doing it even a year ago. So yeah, you've got to spend a little time and spend a little brain power and come to the table ready to communicate in such a way that you both come out happy.
Yeah, absolutely. And dude, there's so many ways to structure deals that people don't really know of, right?
Yeah.
And dude, it's not just a one way street making a deal happen, right? You can do like seller finance, you can take over an existing mortgage. There's so many ways to structure things out there that makes it really interesting, especially in times like right now that people need to
Absolutely.
get creative.
Well, and it depends on the asset class you're into also. We started, my brother specifically, I didn't actually start in multifamily, or excuse me, in single family. We started in quads, but he actually, some of his best deals, he worked through owner financing and almost a handshake deal, and more some of those. I've got another buddy who does really interesting stuff in assuming certain things, and like Pace Morby does a whole section on how are you able to take some of these over, and I think if you're interested in that space, there's a lot out for sure. The water is very deep in getting creative.
Yep. Yeah. Prior to this call, we were just finalizing the details with a seller, where we're doing a seller finance deal. It was going to be like a hybrid between seller finance, and she has some equity in the house. Her mortgage is very small, but she still has a mortgage on the house. So it's going to be a
Sure.
hybrid between like taking the subject to the mortgage plus seller finance deal. So yeah,
I think the biggest hurdle for that is that people just don't, like, again, we go back to what I talked about. It's like, oh, don't be afraid to ask questions and keep promising to make yourself. So don't asking questions, like, nobody's going to get upset if you say, hey, are you willing to own or finance this deal? And if they do get upset by that, then you probably don't have a very savvy person. You may even have an opportunity to be like, hey, let me just tell you about what this is and why this might be interesting to you. There's lots of people that listen to that. But if you don't ever ask that question, you're never going to find out the answer. And you may be leaving a whole bunch of money on the table for it.
Mhm. Yeah, and you might be able to also beat a lot of your competition, because when you're trying to run your underwriting based on the kind of loan products that are out there with the higher interest rates right now, what you can offer will probably be lower. But if you assume their mortgage that they have on the property, or if you do some sort of seller finance deal that you're able to input into your underwriting with a more favorable interest rate, you might be able to increase your offer, right? So not only you're
100%.
beating everyone else, but it's more enticing for the seller, right? Because it's like, all right, well, I can offer, Mr. Seller, I can offer you a lot more if we structure this creative deal this way.
And you're probably saving them both time and money, depending on how you structure that. And you're not going through the entire lending process. Yes, you're going to have to get some attorneys involved to make sure you guys are covered, but there's a lot more to it. I mean, just the headache of going through that process right now alone it could be worth it for a lot of people, right? Like the ability to be really flexible is interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I love that, man. So it sounds like you never even went into the single family space. You started in quadplex and then just
Mhm.
worked your way up from there.
Yeah,
Love that.
no, I mean, I kind of skipped over that, but I was fortunate. And honestly, it was mostly just because I was on the road all the time. You know, my brother and I have been talking about this for a long time. And he owns a couple of rentals, and he still has a couple of single family rentals in where we grew up in Durango. But he was the one. He's like, hey, I know where you're at, and I know how much you're pushing. And we had this joke, like, we're always building other things for other people, other places. He's like, but the way your brain works and the skill set you have, if we partner with a couple of these other guys, we could do a lot of good. And I think the biggest thing for me was really enticing. We got our first pods in Texas. And it's the same thing, like looking into Texas, and why we still invest in Texas is the metrics just work really well there. It's a college town. There's a lot of diverse industry there. It's been there forever, and Lubbock will probably always be there. So we jumped into it in that space, and then just kind of leveraged it from there for sure.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, we have two syndications, one in San Antonio and one in Houston. And I love Texas as well. Um, Dude, I love it, man. So it sounds like you're not really too much in the capital raising side. You're more in the asset management side, more than
Yeah,
anything
we
else.
do. So we all have to capital raise, for sure. And I think everybody getting into it. So Eric and Shane on our team have definitely been the biggest raisers to start with. But I'm absolutely pushing up. I think you and I have met through some capital raising introductions as well. So that's absolutely a focus. And as we grow, I think everybody has to be responsible at some point for asset management, or excuse me, not asset management, but capital raise. Not only even just on the side of bringing dollars, but the ability to have conversations effectively with investors, right? So even if you're not doing the raise, or if, say, 2 out of 4 of us bring all of the money to the table, our ability as a group to functionally speak to all of our investors, because we're all invested as Wild Oak, we're all invested in that as well. We have to know why behind it, and a lot of different conversations that happen. Like, why are we investing? And that's been the biggest mind shift for me too, especially on the capital raise thing. In the beginning, it was almost, and I think that's to the detriment of my action sports background. You want to produce an event, you've got to go find somebody to fund it. You need sponsors. You need to like ask people for their money and show them why this is such a good deal. And it's shifted my brain so much, because what we do here is in service of so many people. We're solving a problem for so many people. And that's the big reason why I jumped into this. Is like, I just saw that ceiling for where I was going. Yeah, we're making some money, but I've got 2 kids, I've got a wife. And so the ability for me to come in and make a little bit of money, but also look around and say, hey, there's so many people who are in the exact same position as I am, spending a lot of time doing something they absolutely love, But at the end of the day, they don't have time to pay attention to growing their wealth and growing an asset. They don't have the time to pay attention to why this makes so much sense for tax breaks and why this makes sense for their life overall and how they're going to get to financial freedom. Because staying in the same place, while it may be extremely rewarding and it may be really fun and you're really proud and you talk at cocktail parties about, jumping trucks over other trucks. At the end of the day, I didn't have the time available to do the job that I really wanted to pay attention to my wealth. So now I get to do that and help other people do that. And that's what's so incredibly interesting to me, and why that capital raise is especially so interesting to me. So I can say and look somebody in the eye and say, I can help you and your family do something amazing, and you get to keep doing what you love.
Yeah, dude, I like that. I like that you come from you approach it from an angle that you can relate to people. That's the best way to uh, be able to bring someone on board, right? You are transferring. If I can feel that energy coming from you, and you're coming from a place that's from your heart, right? Saying, "Hey, I was in your spot. I know what it's like. I know where you can be." It's a lot easier to bring someone on board than just not being able to relate at all, right? And I
Absolutely.
like how you tie in a lot of the stuff that you're doing into the mindset of what you were doing before, right? Because a lot of the skills and everything transfers over to what you're doing now. So I love that, man. If you have, what would you recommend to someone that is just getting started? They either finding out about multifamily syndications. They either want to start investing passively or active. What would you recommend that they do?
I think reading and getting educated is the first step. And I know I'm not the first person to say that or invent that phrase, but getting educated on what it is that you want to start looking for, right? You don't have to have all the answers, and reading one or two books isn't going to necessarily give you all the answers. I would say once you have a fundamental baseline knowledge of just a couple of terms, and they're readily available, search any of the sites. You can come to our site. We have articles up. I'm sure you do as well. Just understanding the kind of the lingo is the first step. And then getting around some people and asking some questions. I've said it a million times and I'll continue to say I have been blown away by how enormously gracious people are in this space to share knowledge. I've never run up against somebody that if I've asked a question, I didn't know something, especially in the beginning, that they were like, hey, let me show you what I think about this. And there's a lot of different ways to cut this cake, right? Like you talk about cap rate, like every single person in a room may have a little bit different definition of what a cap rate is or how it gets calculated or why it matters. So asking a bunch of questions about what that is. So if you're a passive investor, or if you fit into that category, like I just mentioned, like I have money that I'd like to invest, or I may have some money soon that I'd like to invest, but I just don't have the time to spend there. Excuse me, understanding the why, or even just understanding that you're in that space and finding somebody that can have that conversation with you is incredibly important. If you want to get into the production side, the management side of the syndication space, the knowledge is obviously far more important, but the asking the question parts is exactly the same. Find somebody that is doing what you want to do. Take them to lunch, take them to coffee, ask them questions, and ask them to. What I started was like, if you're in my shoes, what should I be asking you? And that's really tough to do in the beginning. But if you can get somebody at a lunch and you're prepared for that conversation, and you go through all your questions and say, hey, what else? What have I not asked you? Because at a certain point, you don't know what you don't know, right? And the second thing I would say is, especially for that, is how can you add value? I had a conversation just the other day. It was a young kid who found me on LinkedIn and said, "Hey, I would just want to ask you a couple questions and pick your brains." Like, sure, I by no means am I the ultimate expert here at all, but if I can help you, I will. And he's living in a southern town. He said, "I'm really interested in it. I started as a real estate agent. I've been working really hard for the last couple of years, but I can see that this is not going to get me where I want to go. What do you recommend?" And I said, "Hey, if it were me, I'd get to know a couple of brokers in town. I would also see who's doing syndications in your town. And especially you can ask those brokers once you establish some relationships, hey, who's not physically here? Is there somebody that's running syndications, say in Idaho, but they live in California? If you live in that town in Idaho and you can start doing some things like, hey, I got your name from a broker buddy of mine. He says you operate in this town. If you ever need anything, if you need me to run by a property, if you ever need me to do whatever, I can be of service. You're immediately adding value. And that would be enormous to me if somebody called me and said, hey, I'm in San Antonio. If you need help with anything, if you need me to run by a property and take a look at it, I'd be like, I will call you and let's have a conversation. So just getting into a space where you have the ability to add value to somebody who's ahead of you in the game, I would be very, very surprised if they don't want to reciprocate that and figure out how to give you a little bit of knowledge and help build you up as well.
Dude, I love that you touched on that because I I don't like the hey, can I take you out for lunch kind of thing,
Yep.
because I feel that I don't know who, like, if someone just approaches you cold call and you don't know who they are and they just want to take you out for lunch, I'm like, dude, that's an hour of my time. I don't know
Yep.
if what I'm gonna tell you, if you're gonna take action or not.
Yep.
Except for like the one you just mentioned, right? This guy, he's being very proactive. He's taking action. He's telling, hey man, I've been grinding. I've been a real estate agent. I've been doing all these things. I can kind of see him like, all right, this guy puts in the work, right? I'm willing to spend an hour
Oh,
with
yeah.
this guy because I'm feel pretty confident that whatever I tell him, he's probably gonna take action. But if someone that I'm just like, hey, I just don't know him and I don't
Yeah.
know if he really takes action, I'm like, ah. But if you add value though, I don't care who you are. If you show that you're willing to do something in exchange for something, like, dude, I'll
Yeah.
sit with you for whatever you like you
But
said.
that's the key. That's the exact key. And I hate to keep going back to the production space, but I tell the story a lot, and I think it's ubiquitous across any industry. There have been multiple times where we've been on a project, and there's been a young guy or gal that's been like, I'm doing this thing, and they're at the, they're level 1, like they're carrying shovels, right? Like, this is okay, but I really want to do what you do. And I have to say, how I learned what I do? I started doing what you do right now, like understanding the why behind it. So whether if it's in this space, it's reading and asking questions and hustling and adding value. Those are those things. And that introduction is incredibly important. Say, hey, I have read these books. I have gone to whatever. I've gone to some meetups. I've gone some things. I've identified you because you seem to really know what you're doing. I would love to pick your brain and ask some questions about what I'm doing and how I might be able to do it better, which is a completely different introduction to, hey, can I take you out to lunch? I just want to learn all the stuff, right? Like those are completely different conversations.
Right. Yeah, take note. Take note if anybody's out there listening to this. There's completely different approaches. One will open the door, the other one will not.
Exactly.
Um, dude, I love this, man. How can people, Ben? We're reaching here the end of the podcast. Um, we I always like to ask, which kind of book would you recommend? I know you touched about on a book earlier on,
Yeah.
but is that the book you will recommend someone to um, read? I like to
Yeah.
focus
Yeah.
more on like a real estate kind of side to it.
Sure. So yeah, best in class as far as asset management is concerned. Like I said, Gary Lipsky, that book is awesome. I've gone back to it a bunch of times. Hunter Thompson's book on how to raise capital, I think is a really good, and the instructions he has in there for capital raises are really interesting. The hands-off investor, I think, is great for anybody who's looking to get into passive investing and asking a bunch of questions. And that baseline terminology, like what is syndication, is awesome. But one that you may not hear a bunch is there's actually a book of 5, but the first book in the series is called Shogun, and it's a book. It's thick, man. It's dense, but it's a novel. But the mindset in this novel and the secondary and third book after one's called Taipan and Noble House. It's basically the Noble House series, but it's very business focused. It's basically about guys using their brain, guys and women using their brain to, how do I maneuver? What do I see my circumstance? How do I change this circumstance? Oh, this happened. How do I use that to my advantage? And I just find it so super interesting as that puzzle piece. And especially in that asset management, how you're thinking ahead, how you're planning, how are you getting ahead? And it's incredibly entertaining. So I think it's a business book in its own right, but I just like reading it.
Say the name again of the book.
Shogun is the first
Shogun.
one. Yeah.
Okay,
Start
I'm
there.
assuming if you Google that, then probably the other 4 books
Oh yeah.
come tied to it.
I think the author's name is James Clavell, but don't quote me on that. But the book's called Shogun. Yeah.
I'm interested. I'm gonna look at that. Cool, dude. I love it, man. How can people find out more about you?
Yeah, you can find us at wildoakcapital.com. We are also producing our own get together here in Denver. I have a multifamily meetup here in Golden, Colorado, but we're also producing our own smaller convention. It's called the Pay It Forward Mastermind. So what we do is a little bit different. It's not so much large ballroom asking questions, raise your hand from the back. We really thrive on small groups working together. We do a lot of the instruction as far as, underwriting and asset management and things like that, but it's much more of a small group feel with some very smart people working with you. And we have people from very first timers to very, very experienced folks all in the same group, asking questions and working together. And we've seen that, blossom relationships and blossom business partnerships. So we're really excited about that. That is October 6th through the 8th in 2022. You can find that at payitforwardmastermind.com. It's a small group. So by the time this airs, I hope we still have a few seats, but love to see everybody there.
Dude, I love it. Pay It Forward Mastermind, October 6th to the 8th. We're going to put the link to it below the show notes here. So everybody's interested and want to go. Is in Colorado, you said? Is that
in
correct?
Denver, Colorado. Yes, sir.
Denver, Colorado. Beautiful city. Awesome. Love it. Ben, it was nice having you on the show today.
Thank you, Seth. I appreciate it, man.